Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Coyotenomics. Today, we're going to be talking about censorship on the internet and the role of corporate and government players in that space. But before we dig into that, we always talk about what we've been doing this week. Luke, what have you been doing this week?
Well, I've been reading a book entitled The Boy Who Was Raised by a Dog.
Ooh.
And it's a very interesting book. It's by a psychiatrist. I need to remember to have this ready, but I don't have it ready. It's by someone named Bruce D. Perry, who's a psychiatrist. And it talks mostly about case studies happening in the 80s that describe what we've been learning about the brain and kind of new research that's been coming in, and basically strategies of dealing with trauma and strategies of building resilience in children. And it's fascinating. One thing that really stuck out for me was that, according to research that he and his associates did, apparently having stable relationships is more of a predictor of long-term mental health than a history of abuse is a predictor of, I guess, mental issues. So a lot of time people are worried that if they were abused in the past, they're going to be caught in a cycle of violence and just repeat the same things over again, or that people will say that it's just a cyclical thing. But yeah, apparently even just having the existence of strong, dependable relationships is more powerful than the influence of even profound early childhood trauma. So that's a very optimistic, interesting book.
Very optimistic take. Obviously, scientifically grounded, I assume. But I like that better than the usual take, which is that you'll never overcome trauma.
Yeah, and it does say that you never quite, but it's all about creating new associations and memories that are strong enough that they supplant the original connections. So you never quite transcend your original history and abuse. But yeah, it's great. I'm definitely going to do a podcast about this one as well. So I'm taking notes during my second listening right now.
Awesome.
And what have you been learning this week?
So as part of the book club that I've been a part of for a while, we've started reading Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. I'm listening to the audiobook on Audible, our soon-to-be sponsor. And I'm finding it, I find it almost too compelling. I find myself having to sort of take a step back because I feel like I'm exactly the sort of person that it's targeted at, and not necessarily in a good way. So I'm enjoying it quite a bit. I find the story very compelling and very, I draw a lot of comparisons to my own experience as somebody who works in STEM. I had a quote that I was going to share, which is the Ayn Randiest thing that I've heard so far in the book, which was, there's nothing of any importance in life except how well you do your work. Nothing, only that. Whatever else you are will come from that. It is the only measure of human value. All the codes of ethics they'll try to ram down your throat are just so much paper money put out by swindlers to fleece the people of their virtues. The code of competence is the only system of morality that is on a gold standard, which is pretty much the Ayn Randiest thing you could say. But, and that's supposed to be spoken by a 14-year-old child, which I find even more hilarious. But yeah, I'm enjoying it quite a bit. I may, it's incredibly long. The audiobook is 63 hours. So it's going to take me a while to get through it, but I will probably, almost definitely, do an episode on it when I'm done.
Cool.
Yeah. So let's dive right in. So we're going to actually post this. We have a huge backlog of footage, but we're going to post this soon anyway because it's topical. Recently, the two main events that I wanted to focus on would be that Donald Trump and several other prominent people in his administration have been removed from Twitter and Facebook and basically banned to prevent them from having a voice. And it's important to note that this is not being done through any sort of government or democratic process. It is a corporate entity making the executive decision to remove them. And the other one I wanted to focus on was Parler, which, if you aren't aware of it, is sort of an alt-right social media site that was formed by a lot of people who are frustrated with what they perceive as censorship on Twitter and Facebook. and Parler has been removed from the Apple Store and the Android Store, the Google Play Store, I think it's called. And it's now also been kicked off of the Amazon web hosting, again, as a way of these corporate entities removing viewpoints that they find problematic from their platforms. And so generally, as like a far right, like libertarian leaning podcast, I wanted to litigate the values of free speech versus the values of like corporate freedom and the ability of a corporation to set whatever rules they want, and talk about if there are better solutions in the middle or not, and just generally sort of find my own thoughts on the issue, because I feel very conflicted. I see a lot of positions on both sides that I find offensive, and I'm struggling to really find my own voice, which is why I wanted to rush out a podcast on this. So, Luke, do you want to tell me what your thoughts are? I kind of went over my overview.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my thoughts are that I tend to believe that private entities such as a corporation like Facebook has the right to discriminate on any standard, on any basis. They could choose to kick people off for any reason. That being said, it does seem to me that a lot of the choices that are being made or the standards that are being forced are enforced very inconsistently. And while I wouldn't say that what they're doing is against the law, and I wouldn't propose that there's like we rectify it through force of law in any way, I would say that in many ways it's still questionable, kind of immoral or shady or gross, and I would promote the idea of pointing that out and talking about how what they're doing isn't necessarily an expression of some consistent ethical position. And they certainly bother me for that reason. People do argue that perhaps because Facebook receives subsidies and is publicly traded, it is in some way a public utility, and so therefore they should be held to some higher standard. I see the value in that, but I think I'm not sure I agree. I just think that's part of an aspect of when you create these moral complications earlier down the line, it'll create all these complications later down the line. And that's kind of what we're dealing with now, is this kind of quasi-governmental institution where it's like, how do you deal with it? It's not public, it's not private. So to apply some sort of simple ethical judgment, I don't think is quite possible, but that's kind of how I think about these sort of things.
Okay. I agree with that, and I've had those exact same thoughts, and I'm generally on the same page. I have two counter arguments, and I'll let you decide which one you want to respond to first. Sorry, I'm putting you in the role of
no, that's okay.
advocating for my own perspective, essentially. But first of all, I would ask the question, and we could discuss whether what was said was an incitement to violence or not. But should someone who is speaking in promotion of insurrection or like dethroning the government be provided any platform whatsoever? Or should we see that as a fundamentally antisocial activity, and perhaps like rather than Facebook taking the blame, maybe we should have a legal standard that says if you are encouraging people to storm the Capitol, that's just fundamentally bad speech on any platform, rather than letting that decision be made by a non-democratic entity that we have very little influence over. And my other question would be that when we take that approach, it seems natural to me, and I believe this is what happened with network television, is that we will have, rather than having one platform that everyone is existing on together, we will fragment into different platforms. We're going to have Parler versus Facebook versus Twitter versus MeWe, and we won't have these groups of people mingling together in the same space, which I think personally is very important for them to do. But I think history shows us that when we allow organizations to make those sort of like editorial decisions, that we're going to see like further division. We're going to see people move to platforms that allow their perspectives rather than working things out together on one platform. So those are my two responses to that.
Yeah, and I like the conflict you set up, where there is certainly some sort of happy middle ground that has to be followed there. Where on one side, I absolutely think that individual companies should be making their own standards and following them, but this is going to promote some sort of fracturing where Facebook will draw the line here. Because I tend to think that government is not a great arbiter for what is determined, what is hate speech or what is incitement to violence. And
Oh,
well,
I
I tend
totally agree. Yeah.
and well, I tend to think that it can be against the law to promote like clear incitement to violence. I generally think that I like the idea of there being different emergent competitive private forums that all try to compete for determining the best standard that caters to as many people as possible. And yeah, obviously with that, you're going to have certain people or certain organizations like Facebook alienate large portions of the public and thus giving rise to institutions like Parler. And yeah, it is sad that this will create, I would think, less of a dialogue because people will all be in their own little, not even in their own little subgroups or in their own circles on social media, but their own website. And and I definitely would want them to all be intermingling and conversating as much as possible. But I tend to think that's just kind of I guess, a necessary growing pains. Hopefully that leads eventually to more of a reintegration. And I don't know, but that's kind of where I would go.
Yeah. Facebook, the motto of Facebook, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember the exact wording, but like Facebook used to talk at length about wanting to create like a more connected world. And that was like their stated objective. And this just seems like a move in the other direction. Like when you are moving, and like I want to say, like, it's not just like Donald Trump. Like Ron Paul was deplatformed from Facebook and Twitter, which is like a very I mean, obviously Ron Paul is a divisive figure, but I've never seen Ron Paul advocate violence or anything that I would consider heinous. Certainly he's a libertarian and there's things to be disliked about that, but and just generally, like, I'm in lots of like liberty movement groups on Facebook that have just been like shut down with no notice.
Yeah.
And things like that.
And I know some cryptocurrency advocates have been removed with no real indication of why. Yeah. Like where like they would literally post like nothing but pictures of them and their family. It wasn't like a huge political advocacy group, and they would be removed. And
yeah,
honestly, I'm surprised I haven't been removed. But
yeah, me too. We'll see what happens after this goes up on YouTube. But interestingly, I have not seen any huge crackdown on YouTube. Compared to other, I don't know if we consider YouTube to be social media or not. I've had this debate probably with you, but with lots of people, whether YouTube is a social media site or not. But
yeah, I'd say so. And I certainly have seen some censorship going back further, and a lot of the what's it called, like soft censorship, where videos aren't removed but they're taken off of the recommended videos list.
Yeah,
and a lot of like conservative or right-leaning perspectives have been soft censored, whatever the term is.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I guess I would.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I think with Facebook, I would argue that while what is taking place is a bit of a fracturing of the community, I do think that what they've been doing, like, they deserve to lose business. Honestly, I'm kind of ashamed that I'm still so present on Facebook, given how poorly they've treated people that I respect. Not Trump necessarily, but more so just generally. Mm-hmm. Like people who maybe value capitalism or value just right-wing perspectives. And
yeah, or just like aren't on board. Like it seems very much to me like people who are against the Democratic Party that is now going to ascend to power. Like in a very mm-hmm. broad sense, anyone who is on the opposite end of that spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I tend to think that they kind of deserve what's coming. And in theory, if a better model emerged, that I'm sure Facebook is very pressured by government to Absolutely. Regulate their site. So they're in a very rough position. So I have no reason to think that if a better alternative emerged that had better policies, they would actually, facilitate a reharmonization of society, because they would probably be pressured in a similar way. So yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated thing that I think is probably in many ways created through this government pressure.
I just think like again, I think network news is the comparison because people often make the same say the same things about it. That like Walter Cronkite like 40 years ago, like everyone was watching the same news, everyone was getting the same facts, and like we were due to the lack of cable television at the time, like everyone was forced to coexist in the same space. And then like you started to get like the Fox Newses and like things became more divided. MSNBC seen very much on like the other side, and you sort of like had this fracturing to specific like channels or whatever you want to call them, like catering to specific niches rather than like having one unified place that we could all be together. And I just see like you already saw it this year. Like Parler is not new right now. It's been around forever, and like, or not forever, but it's been around for a year or two. And like that's exactly what's happening. It's people, not like a diverse group of people who see it as a better platform, but a specific group of people that don't want to be on Facebook are going to another place, and it just creates this divide. And I would say like the goal of social media is to create a place where everyone can interact with each other. That's what social media should aspire to be, is like a space of discussion. I don't know.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's sad. I have no interest in joining Parler because I feel like I would just be talking to like only right-wing people.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating that like because I very much see myself as somebody who probably won't create much original thinking. I see myself as somebody who my main function is to try to learn about as many different perspectives as possible and to try to bring them together and find some sort of semi-rational middle ground, and to act as like a conduit in between point. And that's a lot harder to do if you have to like, join all these separate social media sites to like talk to different subsets of our society. I'd rather just try to create a message that speaks to everyone and then test it in a forum that is containing everyone. But yeah.
It also like from like the raw economic perspective, like if we have 18 different social media platforms, it's more deadweight loss for every creator, because now like a completely apolitical force like you're doing let's plays on YouTube, or you have like a cooking channel where you share recipes. Like now you used to just share on Twitter and Facebook. Now you have to share in 18 different places, which is more effort and more work to reach the same number of people, which creates like a loss that for your company that has nothing to do with you. It's just a drag on the upward growth of any new platform, which again, like stops competition and will stop people from existing in the same spaces. It's just frustrating.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. It's like the same kind of economic inefficiencies that get created through having multiple languages or multiple currencies operating in the same space. It's unnecessary. And I think it's frustrating and unfortunate that this is the way it's kind of going. But yeah, I do think that is largely a reflection of this terrible policy. And it's funny how, because I don't know if you've put much of an effort into trying to look up what like Donald Trump's tweets were. I was trying to find them, and it turns out that the ones I was reading were the ones, and he doesn't really seem to say anything that is any kind of clear advocacy of violence. And a Twitter's press release was that given the context of the political milieu, what he was saying could contribute to ongoing protests and I guess political upheaval or whatever they said. But it was very vague, and it's kind of thing where like, if that's the standard, then nobody's safe kind of thing. And so I'm just kind of blown away that so many people are so comfortable. And obviously not many people like Donald Trump. So many people are very comfortable saying goodbye to him and just getting rid of him in this context. But just what that symbolizes, I think, is very unsettling to many people, as myself as well.
So like, and I think like we could both honestly say like I am not a supporter of Donald Trump. I might have voted for him as a Republican just cause, but like he is not my first choice to run any party. But do you think that, if you had to say, do you think that Donald Trump intended things at Capitol Hill to play out the way they did? Do you think it was just a complete like bungling of the situation? Do you think other people have co-opted his narrative now to like people like the Proud Boys or QAnon or whatever are using him as a tool to like further their own goals? Like, what do you think happened?
Good question. I mean, I would guess that, like, I don't think that Donald Trump is a mastermind. I think he's, like, my guess is he's probably semi-hooked on speed and semi-functioning and mostly like a vibrant personality that is very charismatic, but I don't think he has some sort of plan.
Yeah.
And my guess would be that he wanted to just protest because I believe he sincerely believes he was robbed of this election because it doesn't fit with his narcissism. Yeah. And so I would get, and because the idea of actually storming the Capitol obviously served no function from his perspective. Like, there's no way that could have turned out positively. Like, they weren't about to stage a coup. They were nowhere near taking over. So I think that if anything, that situation was encouraged by the opposite side of the political spectrum. They were, if anything, welcomed into the Oval Office or welcomed into that area so that they would have a clear excuse to say, that this group is like a dangerous rioters. It's kind of, so that's kind of my suspicion, is that if anything, what we ended up seeing was largely a product of individuals being morons and protesting violently, and people in power allowing that to happen. Because I don't see how that could have played out in any way that was to the benefit of Donald Trump or his goals. But I also I haven't put a lot of thought into it, and I haven't watched a lot of footage or like focused on this too much. It's more so the fact that he was removed from social media that disturbed me. But the whole storming Capitol Hill thing, I think, is just a complete like political theater nonsense. So
I agree. And I don't want to focus on Trump too much because it's really like, I am not sticking my neck out to keep Trump on Twitter. It's about like the precedent that it sets, I think.
Exactly.
But it is important, I think, to litigate like what took place. Mm-hmm. I would go a little bit further than that. I think that Trump, like, I think if he would have been honest with you and you asked him what is his goal, he says, I want to bring a violent mob to Capitol Hill to put pressure on people to change the results of the election. I think that is his goal. I don't think he's like, I'm going to storm Capitol Hill and take over the country. Like, some people are putting it as if it was like an active coup, and I don't see that, because I think it would have been a lot more secretive if that's what it was. But I do think, like, basically he's just like, I can summon 1 million people to the Capitol and people will feel the pressure and maybe vote differently. I think that is his intent, and maybe he didn't think, like, I agree, I don't think he's a mastermind. I'm not sure he really thought about like, what is this crowd gonna do? Like, they're not just gonna stand still and chant for 2 hours, like. But I don't know. I do think like he bears some responsibility, like whether he like vocally stated it or not. I think he is the one that whipped a crowd up into a frenzy and sort of just took the leash off, and what they did after that is perhaps not entirely his responsibility, but he doesn't get to wash his hands of it either.
Yeah,
and I think he's the president of the United States, and like the fucking concept of like, what I see is like a very partisan, like, we are going to remove Republicans from the space after Biden ran like a lengthy campaign on bridge building and like unity and bringing people in from the other side. Now it's like fully like, it's their fault, like their party, like, I don't know, it's fucked.
Yeah, like, it's definitely pretty wild. And I do think there's an interesting conversation to be had over, at what point is somebody responsible, especially if they have a big audience and they have a lot of political or social sway. Maybe we should have a more stringent standard on what they can say and what they should be held accountable for. Like, if, some crackhead down the street's like, I'm gonna fucking kill you, like, that should be viewed differently than the president of the United States saying it. I do think there's value in that. All I would say is whatever standard we arrive at should be applied consistently. And If it can be a functional standard that can be applied consistently, it will be. But I'm very skeptical that the current standard we have with regards to the president and why he was allegedly removed is not one that could be. But
do you think that we talked about this on Facebook, but I want to talk about it again on the podcast. Like, do you think that if somebody like vocally, enthusiastically, like, aspires to power, like Trump very clearly wants to be in charge of a group of people that will do what he says, like that's been his thing. Loyalty is his huge thing. And when he puts himself in that position, like the president is a very obvious one, but anyone who is like, I am the leader, these are my people, I think you bear a little bit more responsibility than the average guy, because you are trying to speak for and to a group of people that are listening to you. Like he's in a lot of ways, he's like the Jim Jones guy, right? Like people are listening to whatever he says, people will do what he tells them, and you have to own that a little bit, in my opinion. Where that line gets drawn is difficult, but I'm not sure I would say like the president has the same speech responsibilities that I do. Do you disagree?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I did. I honestly, I tend to think that there would be equality across the board, but I'm certainly open to the idea that, yeah, like as I said, like a raving crackhead on the street wouldn't be viewed the same way as a president giving a speech. I think there can be some. I haven't honestly put a lot of thought into where I would draw the line and how I would draw the line, but
For sure.
I'm open to that for sure. But my bias or my inclination would be to say that there would be a consistent standard for everyone, but perhaps that could be amended in some subtle way to acknowledge that people have different influence and different ability to incite violence. Or
would you comfortably say then that like, let's say, an angsty 19-year-old that writes like, we should storm the Capitol, like this is bullshit, or like, all cops are bastards, or something like that. Like there's lots of inflammatory rhetoric that's out there. And I guess what I would ask is, do you believe that like an angsty 19-year-old should be held to the same standard saying something like that as like the president would? Or is it that like that sort of call to action should never be punished? Like what is your feeling on that other side of the issue? Like,
yeah, no, that's a very tough one and a good question, and not one that I think I can answer in a very satisfying way, because I kind of believe both things. I believe on the one hand that there should be I do actually kind of believe that there should be no legal rules around speech. You should be able to say whatever you want, and if people do something that's illegal, they should be personally held accountable for that. However, if a military leader says, go into that house full of peaceful, innocent people and murder them all, who is more guilty? The individual soldiers who followed the law or followed the rules or followed orders, or the military general who pointed them in that direction? And this is where it gets so complicated, whenever there's a hierarchy at play, and the concept of moral culpability gets so diffused and diluted and mushy, and it's I can't say that I fully believe one or the other. I can see the value on both sides, but ideologically, I tend to think that there should be very little restriction on any speech.
I tend to agree. I think like would you object to the characterization of this argument as like, when is speech action? Like because I think often people will say that like, if you tell someone to kill somebody, that's more than just spreading information and stating an opinion. It is like an action, and an action you can be held accountable for. Yelling fire in a crowded theater is an action more than it is speech. And I think like I would characterize the problem as like, when should we draw a line and say this isn't just like shooting the shit, this is like doing something, and when you're doing something you can be held accountable for it.
Yeah, I think that's much easier to talk about and to draw a line around. Calling fire in a crowded theater, or saying hey, let's murder this person right now, or
Yeah.
hey, let's go hunt down some Jews and kill them, or something. Yeah. So to pick a horrible example,
Just the third thing that comes into your head. Like,
I don't know, I just popped into my mind. But yeah, no, I like that a lot better because it allows for more of a clear distinction that separates that from other types of speech. And I've always thought that, for instance, yelling fire in a crowded theater should be some form of criminal act, however you want to define that.
yeah,
But yeah, it gets very sticky for sure.
for sure. As we live in like a more and more connected society, like, there's never a tree that falls in the forest and nobody hears it. Like, you can't
Yeah.
really shout into the void anymore. There's always someone listening,
Mm-hmm.
and that becomes problematic. I think certainly, would you agree that we seem to be, in my opinion, moving towards a much tighter definition of free speech than we would have considered 100 years ago?
By tighter, do you mean more restrictive?
Yeah, more restrictive. Like, I think things that now would be considered unacceptable speech, uh, or that would be like considered outside the boundaries of free speech, 100 years ago would have been considered fine. Like,
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
better
I
or
think
for
that.
worse. I'm not saying that's better or worse, but I do think it is undeniable that like it is shrinking.
Yeah, I do think so. Like, why do you think that that trend is happening right now? Why do you think there's a trend towards less free speech?
I think increasingly, like just generally, people increasingly turn to the government to resolve those sorts of issues. So like even if you went back, like let's say if you go to the civil rights movement, right? And this is two white guys talking about the civil rights movement, so let's just say that like out front. But like if you look at the rhetoric of say like the Black Panthers, like they would never have said that like there should be a law that you can't call somebody the N-word. They would say that like I should be able to like fight them, like I should be able to retaliate to that and should have the space to like litigate that issue myself. Whereas now I feel like people look to the government to solve that problem. People say that like it should be, you shouldn't be allowed to say it at all. And like if somebody says that in a public place to a person of color, that should be a crime that the government can solve because I don't want to litigate it myself. I don't want to resolve that issue. And increasingly, I would say there's an attitude that like all forms of conflict between two people should ultimately be resolvable by the government because it should never come down to a fight or like a power struggle or things like that, which has just like been a ideological shift in how our society thinks about things. Do you disagree with that?
No, not at all. And I think that kind of speaks to a shift that I've seen a lot recently, or maybe not a shift, but a common form of thinking where people will rightly observe that something is wrong, but then they will conclude that the only way to address it is through government action. But I might agree that calling someone the N-word, for instance, is
Yeah.
awful and disrespectful. But I would personally approach the solution should be that we should call that person out and individually solve it
Yeah.
without appealing to force of law in any way. And I think there's just an automatic assumption in the public oftentimes that if something is wrong, well, therefore the government should get involved, or
Yeah.
that they're the best actor to solve this problem.
And the even more insidious converse of that, which is that if you don't think the government should be involved, you're supporting that speech, which is not the same thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like,
And yeah, it's
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
go ahead. I actually forgot what I was about to say. So I had a second follow-up point to that, but it
Yeah.
slipped away from my brain.
I was just going to say that generally, I think that if you deal with that yourself, and let me freely state, it is hard. Like, if you walk up to like a hardcore racist, it is difficult to engage with that person and like perhaps scary, perhaps you feel they'll be violent. That's all valid. I'm not telling people that they have to go out and be martyrs for the cause. But if a friend, family member, or associate of that person talks to them one-on-one, you are vastly more likely to actually change their mind, open their eyes, and like heal, like actually solve that problem. Whereas government involvement is just going to push them into an underground space where the government can't get at them. The government is not going to go into every basement in the country and like infiltrate the Proud Boys and blah blah blah. Like people are just going to join a social club of people that don't call the police on them. Whereas I think like if you actually sit down with someone and say, I want to understand how you feel, like that can be a very transformative and healing experience. And less people are willing to do that.
Absolutely. And like from my own anecdotal experience, having more of a close relationship is the groundwork that allows meaningful change to happen. And if you don't have that, you're just pissing into the wind. There's nothing that's going to take place. And I think a lot of what else is happening is that it seems like there's less trust in the average person to have the capacity to discern what's true for themselves. Like there's more of a fear that if we just allow people to put out bad information on Facebook, for instance, then like on the coronavirus or whatever it happens to be, then that bad information will just unimpeded filter into the minds of the masses and just create this like horrible movement. And I don't think there's any way. I think, yeah, the only way to really filter through information and filter falsehood from truth is to teach people on a widespread basis how to do that and have this conversation that, you know, starts to, tap into that. And it's disturbing to me and frustrating that so many people have so little faith in the opposite side of the political spectrum. They think that conservatives or liberals are so incapable of figuring out what's true that they have no desire to talk to them, and all they think they should do is just appeal to some higher authority to crack down with violence. And it speaks to like I think a lack of faith and lowered expectations. The bigotry of lowered expectations is alive and well.
Absolutely. Like I find it the breakdown between like the rich and poor, which I think is increasingly divisive and increasingly tribal, is just like so ingrained on both sides, in my opinion, in this idea that like people on the other side are just greedy and like not contributing. Like a rich people look at the poor and see them as like leeches, and like everyone's just like welfare people looking for a handout, like they don't want to contribute. And the poor look at the rich like every person who makes 100K a year is Scrooge McDuck living in a vault full of money that they don't want to share with anybody. And like I tell people, I'm like, when you think of rich people, do you think of like a surgeon or like the CEO of like a non-for-profit? And they're like, no, I think of like Jeff Bezos, like with his weird bald head and his billions of dollars or whatever. And like same with like when you talk to well-off people, like they don't mix. You don't have like rich people and poor people that are friends with each other.
Yeah.
And like that's a big problem in my opinion.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And yeah, I don't know what the solution is. I do think that just people need to learn how to talk to people across the aisle, and it is
see them as a human being. Like really sit down and like don't go into it like I'm gonna fix you because you're broken. Go into it like I want to understand how you feel, and I want you to understand how I feel, and let's be open-minded and meet somewhere in the middle, right? Like the culture of stoicism in our society, that you're somehow weak or less resolved or less sure of yourself if you're willing to have your mind changed by somebody else, is so toxic. And it's taught to everyone. They're like, stand by your values. Like Bernie Sanders is the greatest guy ever because he's never changed his mind in 40 years. And that's like a great thing. But is it not also something to be celebrated, to be like, I evolved with the times and people changed me and I learned the error of my ways? Like, why doesn't that get celebrated?
Yeah, absolutely.
Instead, we look at that guy and we're like, they're a weak shill who fought, like they licked their finger and stuck it in the wind and just like saw where things were going. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
Celebrate growth.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's unfortunate the degree to which that's not appreciated in our society and not celebrated, when people actually just are humble about their perspective and their knowledge of the world and approach a conversation like that. It's always about winning, and I don't know. It's definitely it's an intense time. for sure.
Like, there are people who would be proud, and you see this. I see this all the time, and this year in particular, this started to be a huge thing where they're like unfriend me, or like I'm cutting everybody out of my life that's not like exactly how I think they should be, or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like, no, I pride myself that I have friends that I like fundamentally disagree with. I have friends that I think are terrible people, but like it's like good. I think it's good for me and good for them that we interact with each other, and I see perspectives that are ludicrous to me because otherwise I wouldn't think about them.
Absolutely. And that's the fundamental reason why I tend to create such a diversity in my social media groups as well, is because if nothing else, I want to be exposed to the wide
Absolutely.
diversity of perspectives out there. But I think through that, like, yeah, I've gotten so much value out of just, or
Yeah,
people actually teach me things that I didn't realize they would when originally I thought they'd just be a loon, and they actually have some value to offer. And
absolutely.
it definitely teaches some humility over time.
You're never going to be the one to construct the strongest argument against your own perspective. Like, you're never going
Yeah.
to sit down and be like, I'm going to build the 12-point case that destroys what I believe in. Like, certainly we
Yeah.
try, and that's something to aspire to, but I think you need another person to be like, no, you're ridiculous. Like, let me lay out for you why you're wrong. Like,
Yeah, that's a great point.
yeah, in some ways, only another person can do that for you, and you can do it for them. Like, and that should be something you celebrate. Like, I changed my mind today is something you should be proud of. That like I sat down and evolved and changed my perspective today, rather than being like, oh, I was wrong for the last 5 years and now I'm kind of slowly coming around. Like, the
Yeah.
language people use to describe it, I'm coming around. Like, he's winning me over. Like, no, just be like, I was wrong. Now I'm better because I've changed my mind.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I agree.
This is my third G&T, so I'm starting to get a little.
Cool. I've had one beer and I feel great. This is perfect for
There
me.
you go.
I've decided now I'm gonna start drinking during our podcasts.
Yeah. Only during like the ranty ones. Like, I don't think we need to drink during like I read a book about economics. Like, here's the 12 points that this guy lays out to cure our economy. I don't think that needs copious amounts of alcohol, but
Yeah.
this does.
It's good. It's good to mix it out,
Yeah. You're also
You don't
wearing
need
a
one.
Jägermeister shirt. That's like
I am. I am. This is just like my home shirt. One of my relaxing in
your home shirt.
the privacy of my home.
There you go.
But yeah.
Okay.
What other aspects to this conversation are there?
I wanted to talk about, we talked a lot about Donald Trump and Facebook. I wanted to talk about Parler and being like sort of contrary to the idea of like the free market will figure it out. Parler is being like removed, forced out of the space by like monopolistic companies in the realm. So like Amazon, Apple, and Android are all conspiring to like prevent people from accessing Parler and utilizing their monopoly to do so. And how do you feel about that? Is that a space where we could say like the government needs to step in, or would the government just make it worse?
Yeah, I think this is an especially tough issue for my position. Like, I tend to once again think that monopolies shouldn't be broken up by government, and even if they abuse their power, all that should do is create a social movement that recognizes the abuse of power and, in theory, shifts away and gives them less business. And in theory, the economic incentive to perform well and to operate better than they are operating should be enough incentive, but obviously it's not right now. And I tend to think it's partially a product of our sick culture that is so accommodating of this, and they're so like people are so like they jump at the opportunity to like Trump is banned, hooray. People are not clear advocates of freedom of speech, and I think that's a big problem. And I also think it's a problem that a lot of these companies come from very ideological parts of the world, like Silicon Valley, and so I want to believe that all we have to do is allow this to play out in some dysfunctional way, point the finger at what's happening, allow sunlight to do its work and reveal all the corruption and all the double standards, and ideally we can learn from our mistakes and do better. But yeah, it is like a bad situation.
Yeah. I would challenge you to ask, is there any historical precedent for like sun shining down and revealing the bad guys? Like, I'm not sure there's real examples of like a monopoly failing under its own weight.
I think they're probably. I mean, I think if given the opportunity, I could probably think of a pretty good example of when a company was on an ongoing basis so corrupt and abusive of their power that they eventually inspired people to fund and pursue alternatives. Like I can't think of one offhand. But at the same time, a lot of times monopolies haven't been allowed to grow to such extremes that they are that abusive. Like I know, like the Rockefeller Standard Oil is a classic example. They were broken up, and like Rockefeller and his son spent like the rest of their lives essentially trying to redeem his image by giving all his money to charity and trying to like go against the grain of what they had stood for their entire lives to try to
Yeah.
reclaim their reputation in some sort of positive way.
Sanitize.
And I think what happened there, sorry?
I said sanitize their image.
Yeah, and I think what happened there is a good example of what should happen without the government involvement, where in theory, yeah, we'd have all these political cartoons being produced that depict Standard Oil as a giant squid consuming the earth, and they'd have all this social momentum that was criticizing what's happening. And then in theory, Rockefeller would be like, well, shit, I have a terrible reputation. And in theory, he'd be losing money. In theory, other competitors would be getting more business because of his bad reputation. And either in a pursuit of profit or in a pursuit of reclaiming his reputation and just being seen as a good person, he would change his ways. That's kind of how I would see it happening. But yeah, that's.
Are you familiar with the story of Alfred Nobel, like the guy the Nobel Prizes are named after?
No.
So like it's very much like a similar story. I'm going to share it with you because I think you'll use it as an anecdote.
Cool.
But like Alfred Nobel, like he's only now remembered for the Nobel Prize, but he invented dynamite was like his big contribution. He invented a way to like make nitroglycerin, which was like a weird chemical explosive that was impossible to deal with, into like a practical application for use in warfare, mining, etc. And he very famously sold it to like both sides in several like major military conflicts, and like was seen as this like merchant of death or whatever that just like took advantage of emergent conflicts to make a lot of money. Right. And then when his brother died in a research accident, newspapers reported that he had died because like the exact name had been mixed up. And he read all of these stories about like what a horrible, corrupt, evil person he was in the newspaper, and like these editorials about how like we're glad he's dead, like maybe the world can heal now, things like that. And that seeing that and having like that unique experience of being able to read that is what he said inspired him. And then when he actually died, he left behind the Nobel Prizes, including the Nobel Peace Prize, as like this celebration of like scientific endeavors and making the world a better place. But
that is a great anecdote,
right? Yeah. He literally like, you know, got to see how the world would remember him, and had change it. It's very like Dickensian almost. Like
it is, absolutely. Yeah, Ghost of Christmas Past. Yeah, I love the idea of a war profiteer seeing the light and creating the Nobel Peace Prize is that's a great narrative right there.
Yeah. The Nobel Prizes exist to this day. He made so much money that the Nobel Prizes have been giving away like remarkable amounts of cash for over 100 years, and they just keep going like in perpetuity.
Wow.
Yeah.
Sweet. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you're the leader of this video. Where are we off to next?
Where are we off to next? Do you think if we had a space with no censorship whatsoever, like imagine whether it's government run or corporate run or whatever, just a space where like there was as a stated fact, like absolutely nothing was going to be censored on the platform, do you think that could be a successful experiment? Or do you think there's a reason that we have rules?
I tend to think that it would be probably more functional than most people think. Like, even if there was a horrible leader, like a cult leader who would train people to like go off and suicide bomb, and he'd create generations of people to do that. And obviously only in that context, only the individuals who went off and killed people would be held responsible for those actions, and the cult leader would not, in theory, if there's no laws against speech.
Yeah.
I like to think that eventually people would, they would learn that this is where the road ends, and that, but at the same time, especially in the case of a cult leader who's like filling people's heads with lies, and I feel like I just talked myself out of my extreme position just now, but God damn it.
Like, actually, that sounds horrible.
That's like a really awful situation where I feel like I'd be opposed to that. But yeah, I think in general, I think it would be probably more functional than people think, because yeah, if someone was advocating a terrible course of action that led to the individual's death or personal destruction who took part in it, eventually that would be kind of gleaned from the rest of people that, oh, well, if I do what he's saying, I'll just get shot or seen as an evil person.
Yeah.
Or so I tend to think it would be more functional than most people think, but I also think I'm very open to there being corner cases where, like, yeah, say a cult leader who lies to children and raises them in an abusive environment to go and kill peaceful individuals.
I often think that like social media leads to self-censorship. Like, as people put their if you are a housewife and you sit at home and talk to the same 5 people for your entire life, you can develop some very extreme opinions that then if you put it on the internet and 100,000 people tell you you're an idiot, like, in some ways that I think is the healing process. Like, that's okay. And I think if you take that same person and censor them, then they're going to feel that there's 100,000 people out there that agree with them and that you censored them because they were dangerous. Whereas if you really make them face the reality, I think that's how people heal.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, they're put into direct conflict with the reality of what they're saying, what that leads to, and how that.
Yeah,
it's just because I definitely agree. It empowers people and kind of ennobles them when you force them to not speak of what they're saying. It definitely gives some credence to,
like, I really think, and I'm going to state it in like the most extreme terms possible, but like, I think people today look at a racist person and see them as non-human. Like, they say fundamentally this person should not participate in our society, they should not have rights, they should not get to vote, they shouldn't get to participate, they shouldn't get to speak, they shouldn't get to do anything. And like, I just don't think that's productive. I think that makes more racists, especially when you use a very broad definition of racism that includes like anybody who's not 100% on board with your given progressive agenda. Like,
yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think we see this a lot with coronavirus, where when there was legitimate doctors that were critical of the main narrative around coronavirus and they were pushed underground, I think what that did is encourage a lot of quackery to emerge.
yes.
People weren't kind of hemmed in by a rational discourse of like, there's like maybe the World Health Organization promoting one side, maybe there's more skeptical voices over here, but these skeptical voices were removed. And whereas normally they would, I think, kind of hem in the more extreme perspectives, that was removed. And so just anything was allowed on this side.
Absolutely.
And I think, I definitely think that when people are forced underground, they're forced away from the public discourse that will form their perspectives in a more functional and rational direction.
I think we saw it with coronavirus, the hard science litigated with the methodology of soft science, that we saw like actual scientific experimental data litigated by the process of, are they a reliable source? Like, do they state like prior sources and things like that, which is not a bad way to litigate, which is not a bad way to like assess like a newspaper article or an essay or something like that. But when you actually are studying science, That's not the way you do it. Nobody looks at Einstein and they're like, wow, nobody likes him. He hasn't published anything. Like, why would we listen to this guy? Like, you actually dig in, you do experiments, you look at the data, and you figure out whether it works. And like, you can't litigate science in the way of like, wow, why would the World Health Organization disagree with it? Because they've disagreed with like every science. Their job is to be like the majority voice that opposes emergent science. Like,
Yeah, no, I agree.
I feel like I'm getting a little drunk, but
It's okay. Yeah, you're still coherent. You're good.
good.
Um,
That's generous, but thank you.
I don't think it's inaccurate. It's definitely, I think, a dangerous, like, not only I think is censorship not useful for the purposes it describes it to be. I don't know if that sentence made any sense, but I think, yeah, absolutely. I think that there's unintended consequences where you remove half of a perspective that kind of molds the conversation in a functional direction, and it doesn't just go away. People don't just fall in line and be like, oh, well, I'll now believe, but I'm not allowed what I'm allowed to say. Like, that isn't how people operate. They,
Interesting.
yeah, are very much ennobled, and it's, yeah, I think censorship tends to produce the opposite effect that it's trying to achieve.
Are there examples from your life that you can think of where you feel like you were sort of like sucked into a viewpoint through like incorrect means, and you look back and see, not necessarily to say that you support censorship, but have there been things in the past that you'd be like, censorship might have stopped me from going down this dark path I regret going down?
I mean, possibly, but I tend to think, like, for instance, I was really into Stefan Molyneux for a few years.
Yeah.
And he's very much like inspired by Ayn Rand, like a libertarian, and has a lot of good ideas, but also some fairly intense whack ideas. And especially these days, he's kind of got into like a lot of the IQ debate and very misogynistic thinking. And yeah, and I very much think that I could have benefited from having more, I guess, access to criticism of him in those early days. But at the same time, just having access to dissenting opinions, which I was eventually exposed to. I was exposed to people on YouTube that were criticizing him. I ended up criticizing him in the same way and was removed and blocked from all of his sites. And that was just as good. And I think if I was prevented from looking into his work, and if I heard about him and I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to check him out, but then I couldn't because he was removed from YouTube. If anything, I'd be like, oh, well, forbidden knowledge. And I would never have the opportunity to actually learn about everything he believes and get exposed to why he's wrong and see that whole process. It would stop there.
Yeah.
And yeah, I definitely, I'm not sure. I don't think I would say that censorship would have served me in any point in my life. Do you think that it would, or?
I don't like, I tend to think that a lot of the things I sort of got sucked into wouldn't be the types of things that would be censored in the first place. Certainly, like, I guess at the darkest points of my life, like, I got very into like building pipe bombs and things like that. And like, that is perhaps a place where like access to certain kinds of resources would have kept me on a different track. But again, like, I think the things that I rebelled against were more of like I tended to, I don't think the things that I was sucked in by would have been censored. So I think it's kind of a non-issue.
Right. Yeah.
Like, I would say, like, as a young person, I was very sucked in by what I would describe as like toxic atheism, like the sort of like Bill Maher, like anyone who believes in a man in the sky is a ridiculous moron type of approach to atheism. And then that led me to go to what I would have said like was a very much more fundamentalist, like religious perspective. And now I'm kind of more in the middle, but neither one of those perspectives I don't think would ever have been censored in our country. So
Cool. Yeah, that's interesting. I think Bill Maher is the perfect example of that.
Yeah.
Like, did you ever see his movie that it was like,
Religious?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
I found that so frustrating when I watched it, where everything was about religion. That was the source of all the evils in the world. That's such a
What I
reductionist
just
point of
hate
view.
about Bill Maher is every time you see Bill Maher in an interview, he's talking down to the person he's talking to. Like he
Yeah,
brings somebody on that he feels is smarter than him.
casual condescension for
Yeah.
sure.
Like I don't know how many debates I've seen where it's just like him and some like local hodunk priest, and he's just like, "Oh, like how ridiculous are you? Like, let me ask you about your silly backwards beliefs or whatever." And like, there's no
Yeah,
like genuine, again, like genuine. Let your guard down. Let's have a real, you know. Karl Popper uses the term staked discussion. Like when you have a staked discussion, it means you actually are putting something on the line. You're willing to give up this belief if somebody can convince you, as opposed to just like sharing, which is like, I'm going to tell you what I think you should think, and you can tell me what you think I should think, and neither one of us will change.
or performance. It seems like a lot of discussion online is performance. It's not
I
really
agree.
an active engagement. It's more just like, I want to become famous. I want to be perceived as right.
Yeah.
And that's what it stems from. It's not
Like
really
the
a,
owning culture where like you're trying to come up with like the tight little 2 sentence soundbite that like will wreck them or whatever. Like,
yeah, exactly.
yeah, I try to be more like, I've tried a lot to like adjust to the language, like because I was very much, I'm sure, like as a sort of fringy guy, like in the past I've been guilty of being like, you're retarded, like how could you even think that, fact, 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 fact. And like I try now to be more like, oh, like what leads you to think that way, like how do you define this as opposed to how I define this, and like try to find like fundamentally we disagree on what this is, or we disagree on like what the statement of facts is. You think this is more common than I think it is, or whatever. And that is a much more productive discussion than like, oh, owned, like can't believe you just got wrecked like that. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of things at play that are all kind of colliding together. There's the whole tribalism that encourages that kind of attitude.
yes.
There's that type of video tends to be very popular on YouTube. The drama ownage videos, I know from my days in YouTube, were very, there's a
Yeah.
lot of pressure on YouTubers to engage in that because that would be your most popular video. And it's, yeah, it's a lot of things at play, dark incentives and regressive trends.
There's like, I know you're not a religious person, but Pope Francis at the height of like the Trumping stuff was commenting on it, and he said that like we should endeavor to build bridges, not walls, and to meet. Although we are tempted to meet evil with evil, we should strive to endeavor over evil with good. And I thought that that was like a very good way of like summing up how I feel. Like it's
Yeah,
so tempting to be like, you're terrible, so I'm gonna be like more terrible in the other direction. But it's
yeah.
much better to say like, I'm going to like take the high road and win out.
And I think it reflects some sort of a certain degree of humility to be like, I might not know that you're evil. You might not be as evil as I think you are. From my
Absolutely.
perspective, like I might be wrong. Maybe you're far more justified. And I think it speaks to a certain, or comes from a certain degree of humility
Absolutely.
to be able to approach it like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard for sure.
Yeah. It's not a simple thing to do.
No.
Okay. Do you have any other thoughts? I think we've covered everything that I want to cover, but I'm certainly down to keep chatting.
Yeah, well, we could always chat after the video as well, but I think that covers the video contents that we wanted to talk about in terms of censorship. Yeah, do you want to do final words or?
Okay. You go first.
Okay, well, my final words are that I think we need to, I think a big part of the problem is that we're finding ourselves less able to trust people and less able to engage with humility and actually trust them to be able to have the capacity to discern information, discern truth from falsehood, litigate information. And yeah, I don't see that going well. I think we need to try to some degree, trust people. And even if that's done in small steps, realizing the benefit that can come from extending small amounts of trust, I think can even start the ball rolling. And I think that's going to be a big part of the solution moving forward, not necessarily fearing what is wrong or hateful or bigoted, but trusting people to know the difference between what is wrong and bigoted and what is true.
Absolutely. I would just encourage people, when you talk to someone you disagree with, expect them to be an intelligent, well-researched human being with their own thoughts and emotions that led them to their perspective, rather than thinking of them as someone who needs to be corrected and brought around to your way of thinking. And also stop banning my Facebook groups.
Cool.
Okay. Catch you coyotes next time.
See ya.